It is not unusual in my experience for users to state they have not read the IFU, they cannot recall ever having seen the IFU, and they do not sometimes know where the IFU is kept. We believe this should occur during the staff onboarding and training.
Beyond Clean offers a creative look into the inner workings of the healthcare industry committed to getting it right every instrument, every time. Join us every week as we explore the hidden world of one of the most important aspects of safe surgical care. And now your hosts, Michael Matthews, Hank Balch, and Justin Poulin.
This week on Beyond Clean, we speak with Sara Freiberg, Clinical Education Account Manager with Northfield Medical. Sara has 16 years of experience in the operating room and significant experience as a clinical specialist, product manager, and clinical education manager for medical device companies. She holds both IAHCSMM and CBSPD certifications and is a Certified Surgical Technologist. Finally, Sara is an AAMI ST91 voting board member and an expert on flexible scopes. So Hank is traveling this week and he won't be joining us, but Mike is here along my side, and flexible scopes, just like we were talking about in the intro, Sara's an expert, and we're going to get into flexible scopes today and a multitude of different topics. We're going to go to the basics and talk about leak testing 101, then also point of use cleaning, and then in the second segment, dive into the details of manual cleaning and talk about adverse events and putting AAMI ST91 into everyday use in your department. So, Mike, I've known Sara for a while. She's a coworker of mine, and I'm really excited to have her on the show.
Yeah, I know if there's one, group of people that we just really love talking to on this show, it's educators. This is an education-focused podcast, and we love the chance to get to talk to the experts in the field, and not just experts in the material, but experts in communicating, the critical importance of that material are often those educators. And that's what we get to talk to tonight, and I'm really excited.
Joining us now is Sara Freiberg, Clinical Education Account Manager with Northfield Medical. And Sara, you and I have known each other for a while, but I'm really happy to have you on the show. And I see Hank and Mike post on a regular basis, but you're in that club as well. You're always active on LinkedIn and trying to educate the surgical community on a weekly basis with content. So I wanted to welcome you to the show and thank you for your contributions to safe surgical care.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me.
So we're going to focus, at least in this first segment, I think the entire show has a focus on flexible scopes, but we're going to talk about leak testing 101, and we'll get to point of use cleaning later in this first segment. And I know everybody hears a lot about leak testing, but when it comes to preventable repairs and managing that repair budget, leak testing is so crucial, but it's also crucial for patient infections as well. So why don't we just lay that right out on the table, talk about the general purpose of leak testing, the whys and the whats, and maybe your experience out in the field.
Well, the importance of endoscope leak testing is crucial from both a patient safety perspective as well as an economic concern. Flexible scopes are meant to remain dry. So if we miss a leak from either a cut, a puncture, or a worn O-ring, and the scope enters into the patient, cross-contamination and patient infection may occur. In addition, if we miss a leak and fluid enters into the electronic component, angulation wires, or other areas within the scope, those repair costs go up significantly. We all know that fluid and electronics never mix. However, the proper leak testing steps that are required according to the manufacturer are often misunderstood.
It's funny, I always try to come up with a fun way for people to relate to that fluid getting into electronics and what the issue is. And I always tell the story about how I was a kid, and I was kind of a nerdy kid, and I liked having those calculator watches. And I would jump into the pool and forget that it's not waterproof, and then I'd come out and it would be all hazy. And we basically stick the calculator watch in the window and see if the sun would dry it out, and maybe 25% of the time the calculator watch would come back on, and the other 75% of the time I'd have to save up my paper route money and go buy a new one.
That's a great analogy.
Hey, Sara, everybody is kind of, universally agreed on how important leak testing is, But I think that one of the things that kind of gets overlooked in the whole process is, what about the leak tester itself? What's kind of out there on the market for leak testers? And once you get a leak tester, is there any sort of, preventative maintenance or calibration or anything like that that needs to be done on those?
So there are two types of leak testers: manual, which is a dry leak test, and automated, which is a wet leak test. Most scope manufacturers require wet. Some require both dry and wet. The wet leak tests are the most common method of testing, and I am a proponent of wet leak testing for two reasons. Depending on the size of the endoscope, it may be difficult to safely hold the scope with one hand or have a large enough surface area to safely place that endoscope, depending on the room and sink design. Manually pump that leak tester with the other hand, all the while pumping it and keeping that scope at the manufacturer's optimal pressure for that leak test. A wet leak test, however, allows the endoscope an automated continual pressure where users place the scope in a sink of clean, clear water, fully submerged, and allow users the ability to locate where the leak may be coming from prior to being sent out for repair.
So along those same lines, when you find a scope that is leaking, what do you do from that point forward? How do you clean that scope once you found there's a big hole in it?
So if the scope fails a leak test, it is important to visually observe the area of damage. As an example, maybe the user has detected a small puncture within the bending section area, and the user sees a bubble or bubbles. It's very important that we share with staff to keep that endoscope connected to the leak tester, to keep that scope pressurized. If we remove the leak tester while the scope is placed in the sink of water, we risk the potential of flooding that scope and potentially causing extensive damage to the internal and electronic components. It's important to note that prior to sending a scope in for repair, we protect the user, transporter, and receiver of that scope from any potential infection issues. As mentioned, keeping that scope connected to the leak tester, we would proceed with the manual cleaning and high-level disinfection steps as outlined per the scope manufacturer IFU. And once these steps are completed, we recommend users follow their specific hospital protocol, which may entail marking the damaged area carefully with a colored electrical tape, being cautious not to wrap too tightly to avoid any additional damage to that scope, contacting their supervisor and confirming with their specific scope manufacturer prior to sending in for repair. If the scope has significant damage where the scope will not stay pressurized, we always recommend facilities confirm with their specific scope manufacturer prior to sending in for repair.
What are some common errors related to improper leak testing? What's the impact on the scope and other factors?
Some users depend on their facility's automated endoscope reprocessor, AER, to perform that leak test, because that is what they say they were told that the unit can perform the leak test. That is true. A facility may have a unit that performs this task. However, a leak test must be performed manually first. You will also see on the AER site and their IFUs that the leak test does not replace the leak test being manually performed by the user prior to placing in the unit. Another area is not checking the leak testing unit first. We want to make sure that leak testing unit is keeping the pressure that the manufacturer has set it to. Not checking the leak test tubing to ensure there is no water that has seeped into the lumen from the prior leak test or just being placed on the back of the sink. So if any fluid is within that tubing, it has the potential to enter into the scope. We recommend placing the tubing in a dry area and, based on gravity, loosely coiling that tubing away from any potential splashes once it's disconnected from the scope and prepared for the next user. Once we confirm that tubing is dry, we want to attach that tubing to the scope, ensure that tubing is fitted snug, and we confirm that by gently pulling it. We want to turn the leak testing unit on and pressurize that scope before placing it into the sink of clean, clear water. We should confirm that automated leak testing unit is working correctly, and we can check that a few ways. So depending on the model, we may depress the pin or hold the connector end close to our ear. You should hear that sound secondly confirm the unit is keeping the pressure by looking at the leak test unit to ensure it reads the proper pressure. Once it's attached to the scope, with like our larger scopes, we'll see the distal tip expand and inflate to that pressure, which also confirms pressure has entered into the scope. So if you talk about leak testing, some common errors that we see is when that leak testing unit is attached to the scope and we've taken 30 seconds to observe the scope to see if we notice any damage, we want to fill the sink using clean, clear water. And I always ask technicians, I say, why do you think we want to use clean, clear water? And they say, because we're unable to locate a leak if we have any detergent in the water. And that's exactly true. So if there's any residue within that sink, we want to make sure that it's cleaned out and that's clean, clear water in that sink. Another issue that we see is not fully submerging the scope. So for example, if we have a colonoscope, ideally, and depending upon your facility's sink dimensions, 10 gallons of water will fully submerge all parts and components. Most scope manufacturer IFUs recommend a sink size of 40 centimeters by 40 centimeters, which is equivalent to 16 by 16. So oftentimes users will focus only on the bending section and the distal tip of the scope, looking for that leak. And I always like to share that a leak may occur anywhere on the scope. It could happen in the control body area. You could get worn out O-rings. I've seen leaks everywhere on the scope. It's not always at the distal tip. There's also a common misconception that a continuous series of bubbles emerging from a location on the scope indicates a leak. It's important to note that a leak may present itself as a slow-forming or even a periodic bubble. Per AAMI, SGNA, and ARN, visually observing that scope for any leaks for at least 30 seconds is best practice. And as soon as that scope is fully submerged, the first step to the leak test entails flushing all lumens to remove any and all trapped air. Per the manufacturer's instructions for use, any air bubbles may inhibit disinfection of those channels. And I often hear users that are not aware of this step, or maybe they flush one channel one time and there's still trapped air in those channels. So we should flush until no more bubbles emerge from the channels. And depending on the size of the scope, this may take several flushes with a syringe.
That's a really good point, Sarah, because you can get like this false positive that there's a leak when there's not, all that residual air. One time I knew exactly how many cc's of air was in the full length of that tubing. And I think people think, well, it's really not that much. But if you actually add it up, it's a pretty substantial amount of cc's. Like you can see residual bubbles from not flushing that through for quite a bit of time.
Sarah, I know one of the mistakes that I see people will make on a semi-frequent basis is, when they're doing the wet leak test, they unplug the leak test connection while the scope is still underwater. You don't even think about that, but that opens up that internal sheath, and all of a sudden you've got fluid invasion inside that scope.
You're exactly right. Oftentimes I think they're rushed, right? Sometimes short-staffed, and they feel a little bit behind the eight ball, and they're rushing through some of the steps without maybe thinking them all the way through and understanding that, hey, if I just connect this leak tester, the scope is going to get flooded. It's a matter of knowing the scope.
Before we go on to segment 2, which is going to talk a lot about manual cleaning and also adverse events, I think it's important to talk about what needs to be done for cleaning the scope before it goes and gets fully manually cleaned, which is point of use cleaning. And we were talking even before we got on the air to record, but I had heard very much recently from a couple of customers in their Joint Commission mock survey that they were told that Joint Commission is focusing more and more on point of use cleaning. I don't know if you're seeing that out in the field as well.
In regards to just instrumentation, I was at a facility last year, and they had mentioned to me that Joint Commission came in and stood outside of their operating room, waited for the surgical technician to come out with their instrumentation to make sure it was in a covered container, and they lifted up the container and saw that no point of use cleaning had occurred, and they cited the facility. Yes, they are now going into the OR arena and making sure that that is being taken care of before it comes to the sterile processing department.
Yeah, and I can absolutely confirm exactly what you just said, because at a facility I was at previously when we were being inspected by the Joint Commission, we had the exact same situation happen. And in that particular instance, the OR that the instruments were coming out of was literally across the hall from decontamination. And it was, just in the hallway for maybe a matter of 10 seconds. And we were still cited for not pre-treating immediately, because their point was that, the drying process starts as soon as, that blood is not in the body. And therefore you need to start pre-treating as quickly as you possibly can. And I was wondering, Sarah, we see so much of an emphasis beginning on that with the point of use care. What is the risk, especially when we start thinking about flexible endoscopes, what is the risk of dried on bioburden?
We've all heard of the term biofilm, right? The endoscope and the accessories should be cleaned at the bedside in the patient procedure room immediately after that procedure. So receiving a scope long after a case is ended and or one that hasn't been pre-cleaned is a definite concern, as pre-cleaning is an important step to removing any gross bioburden. If that endoscope is not immediately pre-cleaned, residual organic debris will begin to solidify, creating a biofilm, and it may prove difficult to effectively process that scope, and it may impede on the remaining processes. It's important to note that the manufacturer's instructions for use contain information stating that if that scope is not treated within a specific period of time following the procedure, then an extended soak time must occur. And that extended time can exceed 10 hours.
It's really important because I've seen some litigation related to cross-contamination and infections, and that's an instructions for use, and if you don't follow it, it doesn't really matter anything else. You're liable 100% as a facility. And so you have to be really careful with that. And to your point, that bioburden can create a biofilm, and it can be completely refluxed into the scope where you can't even see it.
That's right.
It's amazing to me because point-of-use cleaning isn't just an emphasis on flexible scopes, although it's really important. But it's crazy to me. I still see case carts coming down into decon, and there's blood, and the tips, the scissors are closed, and there's blood all over the blades still. It's amazing to me that this is so difficult to achieve, but it just seems like maybe that's why the Joint Commission's focusing on it. And now it's time to really reel it in the industry, because it's such an area for improvement.
Definitely agree. I always share that it's my understanding back when I was in school that surgical assistants were taught that during the procedure to keep those instruments clean, because when you hand the instrument back to the surgeon and it has blood on the tip, and if you're talking about a clamp, it's difficult to pull that clamp apart, number one, and then two, for the surgeon to see the tips of that clamp. So you want to keep the instruments in good working order, and you want to keep them clean from a patient safety perspective as well. So I'm glad that Joint Commission is now honing in on that process.
Absolutely. All right. We'll be right back with Sara Freiberg, Clinical Education Account Manager with Northfield Medical. We're here with Sara Freiberg, and we are going to talk about manual cleaning and adverse events here in the second segment. So let's just start right at the beginning. I know we finished segment 1 talking about point-of-use cleaning, but let's start with common root causes of inadequate manual cleaning.
I would say some common root causes for inadequate manual cleaning entail items such as inadequate or no current training protocol. Oftentimes I go into facilities and they weren't professionally trained or properly trained on the current manufacturer's instructions for use based upon their scopes. So they're overwhelmed, right? They're feeling overwhelmed. There are many steps required, but they're feeling rushed. So if you're looking at a hospital that is doing 15 scopes in one afternoon and you have one technician that's doing these scopes, they're feeling that pressure. And there's inadequate staffing concerns. They're sometimes running short-staffed, the room layout. Oftentimes I will go into a department. There was one particular department that had over 100 scopes. There were 27 technicians that worked in that department. And I asked the manager if they had a dedicated staff that cleaned the scopes, and their response was everyone is expected to clean the scopes, and they switch up each week. So 1 week they'll be in the procedure room, and the next week they'll be cleaning scopes. So 27 technicians were expected each week to remember all of those steps, and it's difficult. Sometimes the cleaning room only had one sink with a little counter space to perform the procedures well. A lot of those things are concerns with just the department and the staffing.
Sarah, I know that we get regular training on cleaning our endoscopes from the manufacturer. I asked our education person, how many steps there are in the official IFU on how to clean, and he informed me that he didn't know the specific number of steps, but he knew that the reprocessing manual was 118 pages long. And to your point, I think you're absolutely right that these scopes are so complex that, simply doing it every now and then and being trained that one time just simply isn't going to be adequate. What kind of training regimen do you recommend?
It is not unusual in my experience for users to state they have not read the IFU. They cannot recall ever having seen the IFU, and they do not sometimes know where the IFU is kept. We believe this should occur during the staff onboarding and training. So we discussed the importance of the IFU, but can we ensure all departments that care for scopes, sterile processing, GI labs, surgery centers, that they know of the instructions for use and how to gain access? Joint Commission may come through a cleaning department and ask the manager who the most recent employee is, walk up to them while at the cleaning sink, and ask the technician if they know where the IFU to that device is located, and then have to follow it. If not, Joint Commission may ask, how can you ensure you are following the proper protocol? And we should be cautious to answer that so-and-so taught me a few months ago. Staff should be aware of the importance of the instruction for use and the regulatory guidelines associated with their devices. So does that fall upon the department managers to have maybe a weekly, monthly, quarterly meeting with staff to go over those steps, highlighting specific areas that pertain to their specific scopes within their department? I believe it has to come from the top, and I believe there should be accountability so we may ensure both patient and employee safety.
Along those same lines, I know that what really kind of sounded the alarm for most hospitals on just how complex and how difficult these scopes are to clean was the big, ERCP infection outbreak. You're in and out of a lot of hospitals, and I know that Olympus in particular has made some changes to try and make, the ERCP scopes more cleanable, and I think some of the other manufacturers have as well. From what you're seeing, are we turning the corner on the safety of the ERCP scope, or is that still a significant challenge that's out there?
I wouldn't answer that we've overcome it. There are many documented and undocumented outbreaks in publication, and as we are aware, and to your point, in the public eye, in the news, regarding all types of scopes. The outbreaks include patient infections from multiple drug-resistant organisms, which have led to both illnesses and to death. So with the exception of a design error, all of these outbreaks can be traced back to a misstep and or staff not properly trained. The FDA and CDC have specific protocol language on their websites in regards to the additional steps pertaining to duodenoscopes. So the surface and surrounding area of, say, the forceps elevator, the groove, the guide wire locking groove, and the forceps elevator recess, they have a complex shape. Manufacturers' IFU's instructions call for how we must reprocess these parts carefully, because insufficient processing may pose an infection control risk to the patient and or the operators. And so since the outbreak began several years ago, the FDA has continued collaborations with duodenoscope and automated endoscopic reprocessor firms to validate those reprocessing instructions. The FDA collaborates with government agencies such as the CDC, Centers for Disease Control, as well as the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. The FDA and the Joint Commission have also teamed together, and they've posted a recorded webinar on the FDA's website, and it's available to the public to discuss those concerns regarding the reprocessing of those scopes.
So, Sara, let's talk a little bit about the connection of this poor manual cleaning to adverse events. I know that's a pretty easy leap off from the situation with the ERCP scopes, and I think CRE is just such an obvious connection between the two, but maybe there are other points of emphasis in that regard.
When I'm providing education, I always call out and I ask the staff, are they familiar with MDRs, which are medical device reports? That is under the FDA, Regulation 21 CFR 803, Code of Federal Regulations. This contains mandatory requirements for manufacturers, importers, and device user facilities to report certain device-related adverse events and product problems to the FDA. Each year, the FDA receives several 100,000 reports, suspected device-associated deaths, serious injuries, or malfunctions. The FDA uses these device reports to monitor that device performance. They want to detect any potential device-related safety issues and contribute to the benefit-risk assessments of these devices. You know, there's so many different avenues when you talk about scopes and adverse events. Even if you talk about water temperature, think about when you wash your hands. You have to use warm water, and you have to have that friction of your hands, and that is what starts that process to clean your hands. So the correct water temperature is very important for scopes. It must be warm, or it may impede the cleaning process. So we should also follow the manufacturer's detergent IFU. Some manufacturers also provide an automated low-foaming detergent that's temperature-specific, and that will alert the user if that water temperature is not above, say, 97 degrees, and then they'll add warm water to it. It's also important that the correct detergent amount is added. It's ounces per gallon. If you have 10 gallons of water in your sink, users should measure or provide 10 complete pumps equating to those 10 ounces of detergent. And more detergent is not better, because we talked about biofilm earlier. That may form a film on the scope and actually impede the high-level disinfection or sterilization process. So that's important to know.
Let me chime in on too much enzymatic. I think it's just you don't see the fill line everywhere you go. They don't necessarily have an automatic dispenser to do the right proportioning of the enzymatic to the water. A lot of times people just think more is better. And if they have just the detergent sitting in the bottle alongside the sink with the pump, they just start pumping and pumping and pumping. And I don't think we a lot of times say not only don't use too much detergent, but it's really that emphasis on rinsing. And I don't think there's always such a great emphasis on process to remove that chemical. And if you are finding yourself just going pump, 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 you know, you might even have a higher concentrated enzymatic. That dilution or the proportion is 1/4 of an ounce to a gallon. Well, if you've got 4 gallons filled in the sink, it only takes one pump. I've never seen anybody only hand pump once. And so I feel like that can never be stressed enough. And then on top of it, really proper rinsing, because if that enzymatic residue gets left behind, it can cause a tacky feeling on the outside of the scope. Enzymatic is used to break down protein, right? So nobody wants enzymatic inside of their body either.
You're right about rinsing that scope under free-flowing water is definitely something that has to be incorporated that we don't see. We'll sometimes see staff just placing the scope in a sink full of water. Well, what do you have? You just have the residue from the detergent that was on the scope now sitting in the sink full of clear water. So you still have residue. So it should be under free-flowing water. Brushing is such a huge, and I'm sure you've seen this as well, Justin, staff maybe not brushing all of the channels. I sometimes see them brushing the straight suction channel. You know, it has that bifurcation, and they brush that 90 degrees, but they sometimes forget there's a 45-degree angle within that channel as well. So that I see. Using the correct size brush is huge, and I always emphasize this as well, that Too small of a brush runs the risk of us unable to reach those channel walls. Too large of a brush runs the risk of potentially damaging the channel or damaging the brush. I've seen where bristles come loose and may break off and remain within that channel, which of course leads to an unnecessary increased repair cost. Always following the manufacturer instruction for use according to the brush size. I often see facilities using one size brush for all of their lumen devices to save on cost. When users are brushing the channels, we recommend that they use short strokes because we want to provide that friction within that channel. Once that brush completely exits the channel, we should use our gloved hand to wipe away any debris from that brush tip before reintroducing into the channel. We recommend brushing each channel a minimum of 3 times or until no more debris. So it may take several times that you're brushing. If you're using a single-use brush, that it should be disposed of when the brushing is completed. And if you're using a multi-use brush, it should be reprocessed following that scope.
Sarah, it seems like, especially when we're talking about flexible endoscopes, one of the most common instructions in any IFU, whether you're talking about flexibles or not, is visual inspection, right? You see it over and over and over. It has to be visually clean. But yet when it comes to flexible endoscopes, we kind of just assume that if we do all the right steps, that everything on the inside should be clean. It's very difficult to ever say with any certainty if you can't look at it. And I know that several companies are starting to come into the market with flexible borescopes that are designed to, I describe them as a scope for a scope. And they're designed to enable technicians to actually inspect these channels. Are you seeing those scopes being very widely adopted or not? And if so, what are some of the risks that go along with that?
I have seen borescopes used in some facilities. Several methods can be used to evaluate the results of the cleaning process. And from a patient safety perspective, all guidelines recommend the importance of inspecting the endoscope prior, during, and following patient procedures. That includes visual inspections. For example, when users are performing a leak test, taking at least 30 seconds to do a complete visual inspection of the endoscope. We recommend a light above the sink area, as well as a 10 times lighted magnification for deeper inspections. The very distal tip of the endoscope has what is called a C cover. That C cover houses the light guide lenses, suction biopsy channel, air water channel, objective lens, and depending upon the model, sometimes a high pressure irrigation port. If we have any missing parts or components, we want to retrace our steps. Could it be a potential adverse event? Yes. If left inside the patient, absolutely. There is specific language in AAMI ST91 where it states tools such as video borescopes of an appropriate dimension, length, and diameter may be used to visually inspect the internal channels. A borescope would allow users to inspect the internal portion for any visual debris or damage, and depending upon the facility's infection prevention protocol, protein testing may also be incorporated. I agree that scopes should be inspected throughout every process to ensure patient safety, as well as confirm each scope is in proper working order for the next procedure. Some challenges with borescopes may entail staff being properly trained to detect areas of bioburden or what some potential damage areas may look like. So some hands-on education prior to use is very important. I also believe thorough, proper cleaning processes for that borescope as well to ensure patient safety.
We're going to end segment 2 talking a little bit about AAMI ST91. I know you're on the AAMI committee, and we had Ralph Basile on just a couple of weeks ago, and he was talking about AAMI and ISO and ASTM, and we really got into the details of all of that. But what we never really dove into in that interview that I think maybe would be a good way to close out segment 2 would be talking about integrating AAMI ST91 into the everyday life of the department.
I share AAMI ST91 and refer to AAMI ST91 each time I am giving scope education. Sometimes I will let users know that if they are confused about one of the processes in their instruction for use, that they have guidelines such as AAMI ST91 and SGNA as a resource. And it's a great resource because they literally spell out the step for the user. Oftentimes we find an employee where we ask how they're trained for scopes and they say, oh, well, Karen trained Mary who trained John. yet all are performing the steps incorrectly or maybe potentially missing a step, because all of these steps are so crucial for patient safety as well as the longevity of their device. So we always suggest reviewing and sharing with staff those AAMI guidelines. It's such a valuable resource when users may view the instructions for use as maybe being a little bit unclear.
Sara, that's great information. Thank you so much for coming on the show and being our guest this week. I know I really enjoyed a lot of the conversation around point of use cleaning. I just think it's such a hot topic.
Agreed.
That was Sara Freiberg, Clinical Education Account Manager with Northfield Medical. And I've known Sara for a while now, Mike, and I think the takeaway for me, stressing the importance of point of use cleaning. I was really glad to hear that the Joint Commission is beginning to take a special interest in focusing on this matter, because I know you shared a story, Sara had a story, but really once blood, bioburden, or biomatter of any type dry up on an instrument, let alone inside of a flexible scope, even on a basic stainless steel instrument, once it dries, it begins to eat away at that passivation layer. It causes pitting, rusting, corrosion, and the biggest issue being cross-contamination. We want our patients to have safe care, and it really does begin at the point of use. So I just thought that can't be stressed enough, and it was great to hear Sara's passion for that topic as well.
Yeah, and you hit the nail right on the head when you talk about how important it is to get a bioburden breaking down, as quickly as possible. And, that's one of those things that, I don't think is well understood in our industry, is how quickly blood or whatever bioburden is, how quickly that starts to dry and break down the surface of those instruments. And, we like to pretend as though materials like stainless steel are indestructible, but flat out truth is they are not. They are vulnerable to this stuff. And the end result for the patient can even be catastrophic. And that's especially the case when we start talking about, flexible endoscopes. And we've seen that play out in the public arena on more than one occasion. So yeah, it's absolutely great to hear some very important stuff that our listeners can take back and begin putting into practice in their departments, tomorrow.
Yeah, we reviewed a lot of different things with Sara, but even some of just the basics, and it never hurts to remind consistently about the basic protocols and basic processes that have to be adhered to every single day. And we heard her talk about instructions for use a lot. And I know a lot of times when I do education, people are like, oh, great, he's going to give me that instructions for use line again. But that's just the reality of it, is if you want to decrease liability for your institution in the event of an adverse event like we talked about in this episode, then you have got to follow the instructions for use to the T. And it is a challenge, and I'm glad we dove into that a little bit too. I know we talked about biofilm, and that's a topic we really should maybe vet out in a future episode. So we'll put that on the list to maybe explain biofilm in more detail for a future episode. But that's going to do it for this week's show, and a reminder that you can support Beyond Clean by subscribing to us on iTunes and Stitcher. We'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review, because your feedback is important to the show. And if you have any topics that you'd like us to cover on a future episode, or if you would like to share a picture anonymously on our Instagram page, simply send us an email to info@beyondclean.net. On behalf of Hank, Mike, and myself, thank you for listening to another edition of Beyond Clean.